The Poisoned Chocolates Case. Anthony Berkeley. Chapter 1. Roger Sheringham took a sip of the old brandy in front of him and leaned back in his chair at the head of the table. Through the haze of cigarette smoke, eager voices reached his ears from all directions, prattling joyfully upon this and that connected with murder, poisons, and sudden death. For this was his very own crime circle, founded, organized, collected, and now run by himself alone. And when at the first meeting 5 months ago he had been unanimously elected its president, he had been as full of proud delight as on that never-to-be-forgotten day in the dim past when a cherub disguised as a publisher had accepted his first novel. He turned to Chief Inspector Moresby of Scotland Yard, who, as the guest of the evening, was sitting on his right, engaged, a little uneasily, with a positively enormous cigar. Honestly, Moresby, without any disrespect to your own institution, I do believe that there's more solid criminological genius in this room, intuitive genius, I mean, not capacity for taking pains, than anywhere in the world outside the Sûreté in Paris. Do you, Mr. Sheringham, said Chief Inspector Moresby tolerantly. Moresby was always kind to the strange opinions of others. Well, well. And he applied himself again to the lighted end of his cigar, which was so very far from the other that Moresby could never tell by mere suction at the latter whether the former was still alight or not. Roger had some grounds for his assertion beyond mere parental pride. Entry into the charmed crime circle's dinners was not to be gained by all and hungry. It was not enough for a would-be member to profess an adoration for murder and let it go at that. He or she had got to prove that they were capable of worthily wearing their criminological spurs. Not only must the interest be intense in all branches of the science, in the detection side, for instance, just as much as the side of criminal psychology, with the history of all cases of the least importance at the applicant's fingertips, but there must be constructive ability too. The candidate must have a brain and be able to use it. To this end, a paper had to be written, from a choice of subjects suggested by members and submitted to the president, who passed on such as he considered worthy to the members in conclave, who thereupon voted for or against the suppliant's election. And a single adverse vote meant rejection. It was the intention of the club to acquire eventually 13 members, but so far only 6 had succeeded in passing their tests, and these were all present on the evening when this chronicle opens. There was a famous lawyer, a scarcely less famous woman dramatist, a brilliant novelist who ought to have been more famous than she was, the most intelligent, if not the most amiable, of living detective story writers, Roger Sheringham himself, and Mr. Ambrose Chitterwick, who was not famous at all, a mild little man of no particular appearance who had been even more surprised at being admitted to this company of personages than they had been at finding him amongst them. With the exception of Mr. Chitterwick, then, it was an assembly of which any organizer might have been proud. Roger, this evening, was not only proud, but excited too, because he was going to startle them, and it is always exciting to startle personages. He rose to do so. "Ladies and gentlemen," he proclaimed, after the welcome of glasses and cigarette cases drummed on the table had died away. "Ladies and gentlemen, in virtue of the powers conferred by you, the president of our circle is permitted to alter at his discretion the arrangements made for any meeting. You all know what arrangements were made for this evening. Chief Inspector Moresby, whom we are so glad to welcome as the first representative of Scotland Yard to visit us," more drumming on the table. Chief Inspector Moresby was to be lulled by rich food and sound wine into being so indiscreet as to tell us about such of his experiences as could hardly be given to a body of pressmen. More and longer drumming. Roger refreshed himself with a sip of brandy and continued. "Now I think I know Chief Inspector Moresby pretty well, ladies and gentlemen, and the occasions are not a few on which I too have tried, and tried very hard, to lure him similarly into the paths of indiscretion. But never once have I succeeded. I have therefore little hope that this circle, lure it never so cooingly, will succeed in getting from the Chief Inspector any more interesting stories than he would mind being published in the Daily Courier tomorrow. Chief Inspector Moresby, I am afraid, ladies and gentlemen, is unlurable." I have therefore taken upon myself the responsibility of altering our entertainment for this evening, and the idea that has occurred to me in this connection will, I both hope and believe, appeal to you very considerably. I venture to think that it is both novel and enthralling." Roger paused and beamed on the interested faces around him. Chief Inspector Moresby, a little puce below the ears, was still at grips with his cigar. "My idea," Roger said, "is connected with Mr. Graham Bendix." There was a little stir of interest. "Or rather," he amended, more slowly, "with Mrs. Graham Bendix." The stir subsided into a still more interested hush. Roger paused, as if choosing his words with more care. "Mr. Bendix himself is personally known to one or two of us here. Indeed, his name has actually been mentioned as that of a man who might possibly be interested, if approached, to become a member of this circle, by Sir Charles Wildman, if I remember rightly." The barrister inclined his rather massive head with dignity. "Yes, I suggested him once, I think." "The suggestion was never followed up," Roger continued. "I don't quite remember why not. I think somebody else was rather sure that he would never be able to pass all our tests. But in any case, the fact that his name was ever mentioned at all shows that Mr. Bendix is to some extent at least a criminologist, which means that our sympathy with him in the terrible tragedy that has befallen him is tinged with something of a personal interest, even in the case of those who, like myself, are not actually acquainted with him." "Here, here," said a tall, good-looking woman on the right of the table, in the clear tones of one very well accustomed to saying "here, here" weightily at appropriate moments during speeches in case no one else did. This was Alicia Dammers, the novelist, who ran women's institutes for a hobby, listened to other people's speeches with genuine and altruistic enjoyment, and, in practice the most staunch of conservatives, supported with enthusiasm the theories of the Socialist Party. "My suggestion is," Roger said simply, "that we turn that sympathy to practical uses." There was no doubt that the eager attention of his audience was caught. Sir Charles Wildman lifted his bushy grey brows, from under which he was wont to frown with menacing disgust at the prosecution's witnesses who had the bad taste to believe in the guilt of his own client, and swung his gold-rimmed eyeglasses on their broad black ribbon. On the other side of the table, Mrs. Fielder Fleming, a short, round, homely-looking woman who wrote surprisingly improper and most successful plays and looked exactly like a rather superior cook on her Sunday out, nudged the elbow of Miss Dammers and whispered something behind her hand. Mr. Ambrose Chitterwick blinked his mild blue eyes and assumed the appearance of an intelligent nanny-goat. The writer of detective stories alone sat apparently unmoved and impassive, but in times of crisis he was wont to model his behavior on that of his own favorite detective, who was invariably impassive at the most exciting moments. "I took the idea to Scotland Yard this morning," Roger went on, "and though they never encourage that sort of idea there, they were really unable to discover any positive harm in it, with the result that I came away with a reluctant but nevertheless official permission to try it out. And I may as well say at once that it was the same cue that prompted this permission as originally put the whole thing into my head." Roger paused impressively and glanced round. "The fact that the police have practically given up all hope of tracing Mrs. Bendix's murderer." Ejaculations sounded on all sides, some of dismay, some of disgust, and some of astonishment. All eyes turned upon Moresby. That gentleman, apparently unconscious of the collective gaze fastened upon him, raised his cigar to his ear and listened to it intently, as if hoping to receive some intimate message from its depths. Roger came to his rescue. "That information is quite confidential, by the way, and I know none of you will let it escape beyond this room, but it is a fact. Active inquiries, having resulted in exactly nothing, are to be stopped. There is always hope, of course, that some fresh fact may turn up, but without it the authorities have come to the conclusion that they can get no farther. My proposal is, therefore, that this club should take up the case where the authorities have left it." And he looked expectantly round the circle of upturned faces. Every face asked a question at once. Roger forgot his periods in his enthusiasm and became colloquial. Why, you see, we're all keen, we're not fools, and we're not, with apologies to my friend Moresby, tied to any hard and fast method of investigation. Is it too much to hope that with all six of us on our mettle and working quite independently of each other, one of us might achieve some result where the police have, to put it bluntly, failed? I don't think it's outside the possibilities. What do you say, Sir Charles? The famous counsel uttered a deep laugh. "'Pon my word, Sheringham, it's an interesting idea, but I must reserve judgment till you've outlined your proposal in a little more detail." "I think it's a wonderful idea, Mr. Sheringham," cried Mrs. Fielder Fleming, who was not troubled with a legal mind. "I'd like to begin this very evening." Her plump cheeks positively quivered with excitement. "Wouldn't you, Alicia?" "It has possibilities," smiled that lady. "As a matter of fact," said the writer of detective stories, with an air of detachment, "I'd formed a theory of my own about this case already. His name was Percy Robinson, but he wrote under the pseudonym of Morton Harrogate Bradley, which had so impressed the more simple citizens of the United States of America that they had bought 3 editions of his first book on the strength of that alone. For some obscure psychological reason, Americans are always impressed by the use of surnames for Christian, and particularly when one of them happens to be the name of an English watering place. Mr. Ambrose Chitterwick beamed in a mild way, but said nothing. "Well," Roger took up his tale, "the details are open to discussion, of course, but I thought that if we all decide to make the trial, it would be more amusing if we worked independently. Moresby here can give us the plain facts as they're known to the police. He hasn't been in charge of the case himself, but he's had 1 or 2 jobs in connection with it and is pretty well up in the facts. Moreover, he has very kindly spent most of the afternoon examining the dossier at Scotland Yard so as to be sure of omitting nothing this evening. When we've heard him, some of us may be able to form a theory at once. Possible lines of investigation may occur to others, which they will wish to follow up before they commit themselves. In any case, I suggest that we allow ourselves a week in which to form our theories, verify our hypotheses, and set our individual interpretations on the facts that Scotland Yard has collected, during which time no member shall discuss the case with any other member. We may achieve nothing, most probably we shall not, but in any case it will be a most interesting criminological exercise. For some of us practical, for others academical, just as we prefer. And what I think should be most interesting will be to see if we all arrive at the same result or not. Ladies and gentlemen, the meeting is open for discussion, or whatever is the right way of putting it. In other words, what about it? And Roger dropped back, not reluctantly, into his seat. Almost before his trousers had touched it, the first question reached him. "Do you mean that we're to go out and act as our own detectives, Mr. Sheringham, or just write a thesis on the facts that the Chief Inspector is going to give us?" asked Alicia Dammers. "Whichever each one of us preferred, I thought," Roger answered. "That's what I meant when I said that the exercise would be practical for some of us and academic for others." "But you've got so much more experience than us on the practical side, Mr. Sheringham," pouted Mrs. Fielder Fleming. "Yes," pouted. "And the police have so much more than me," Roger countered. "It will depend whether we use deductive or inductive methods, no doubt," observed Mr. Morton Harrogate Bradley. "Those who prefer the former will work from the police facts and won't need to make any investigations of their own, except perhaps to verify a conclusion or two. But the inductive method demands a good deal of inquiry." "Exactly," said Roger. "Police facts and the deductive method have solved plenty of serious mysteries in this country," pronounced Sir Charles Wildman. "I shall rely on them for this one." "There's one particular feature of this case," murmured Mr. Bradley to nobody, "that ought to lead one straight to the criminal. I've thought so all the time. I shall concentrate on that." "I'm sure I haven't the remotest idea how one sets about investigating a point if it becomes desirable," observed Mr. Chitterwick uneasily, but nobody heard him, so it did not matter. "The only thing that struck me about this case," said Alicia Dammers very distinctly, "regarded, I mean, as a pure case, was its complete absence of any psychological interest whatever. And without actually saying so, Miss Dammers conveyed the impression that if that were so, she personally had no further use for it. "I don't think you'll say that when you've heard what Moresby's got to tell us," Roger said gently. "We're going to hear a great deal more than has appeared in the newspapers, you know." "Then let's hear it," suggested Sir Charles bluntly. "We're all agreed then," said Roger, looking round as happily as a child who has been given a new toy. "Everybody is willing to try it out?" Amid the ensuing chorus of enthusiasm, one voice alone was silent. Mr. Ambrose Chitterwick was still wondering, quite unhappily, how, if it ever became necessary to go a-detecting, one went. He had studied the reminiscences of 100 ex-detectives, the real ones, with large black boots and bowler hats, but all he could remember at that moment, out of all those scores of fat books, published at 18 and sixpence and remaindered a few months later at 18p, was that a real detective, if he means to attain results, never puts on a false moustache, but simply shaves his eyebrows. As a mystery-solving formula, this seemed to Mr. Chitterwick inadequate. Fortunately, in the buzz of chatter that preceded the very reluctant rising of Chief Inspector Moresby, Mr. Chitterwick's poltroonery went unnoticed. Chapter 2. Chief Inspector Moresby, having stood up and blushingly received his tribute of handclaps, was invited to address the gathering from his chair and thankfully retired into that shelter. Consulting the sheaf of notes in his hand, he began to enlighten his very attentive audience as to the strange circumstances connected with Mrs. Bendix's untimely death. Without reproducing his own words and all the numerous supplementary questions which punctuated his story, the gist of what he had to tell was as follows. On Friday morning, the 15th of November, Graham Bendix strolled into his club, the Rainbow, in Piccadilly, at about 10:30 and asked if there were any letters for him. The porter handed him a letter and a couple of circulars, and he walked over to the fireplace in the hall to read them. While he was doing so, another member entered the club. This was a middle-aged baronet, Sir Eustace Pennefather, who had rooms just round the corner in Berkeley Street, but spent most of his time at the Rainbow. The porter glanced up at the clock, as he did every morning when Sir Eustace came in, and, as always, it was exactly 10:30. The time was thus definitely fixed by the porter beyond any doubt. There were 3 letters and a small parcel for Sir Eustace, and he too took them over to the fireplace to open, nodding to Bendix as he joined him there. The 2 men knew each other only very slightly, and had probably never exchanged more than half a dozen words in all. There were no other members in the hall just then. Having glanced through his letters, Sir Eustace opened the parcel and snorted with disgust. Bendix looked at him inquiringly, and with a grunt, Sir Eustace thrust out the letter which had been enclosed in the parcel, adding an uncomplimentary remark upon modern trade methods. Concealing a smile, Sir Eustace's habits and opinions were a matter of some amusement to his fellow members. Bendix read the letter. It was from the firm of Mason and Sons, the big chocolate manufacturers, and was to the effect that they had just put on the market a new brand of liqueur chocolates designed especially to appeal to the cultivated palates of men of taste. Sir Eustace being, presumably, a man of taste, would he be good enough to honour Mr. Mason and his sons by accepting the enclosed £1 box, and any criticisms or appreciation that he might have to make concerning them would be esteemed almost more than a favour. "Do they think I'm a blasted chorus girl," fumed Sir Eustace, a choleric man, "to write 'em testimonials about their blasted chocolates? Blast 'em. I'll complain to the blasted committee. That sort of blasted thing can't blasted well be allowed here." For the Rainbow Club, as everyone knows, is a very proud and exclusive club indeed, with an unbroken descent from the Rainbow Coffee House, founded in 1734. Not even a family founded by a king's bastard can be quite so exclusive today as a club founded on a coffee house. "Well, it's an ill wind so far as I'm concerned," Bendix soothed him. "It's reminded me of something. I've got to get some chocolates myself to pay an honourable debt. My wife and I had a box at the Imperial last night, and I bet her a box of chocolates to 100 cigarettes that she wouldn't spot the villain by the end of the second act. She won. I must remember to get them. It's not a bad show. The creaking skull. Have you seen it? Not blasted likely, replied the other, unsoothed. Got something better to do than sit and watch a lot of blasted fools messing about with phosphorescent paint and pooping off blasted pop guns at each other. Want a box of chocolates, did you say? Well, take this blasted one. The money saved by this offer had no weight with Bendix. He was a very wealthy man, and probably had enough on him in actual cash to buy 100 such boxes. But trouble is always worth saving. Sure you don't want them? He demurred politely. In Sir Eustace's reply, only one word, several times repeated, was clearly recognizable. But his meaning was plain. Bendix thanked him, and most unfortunately for himself, accepted the gift. By an extraordinarily lucky chance, the wrapper of the box was not thrown into the fire, either by Sir Eustace in his indignation or by Bendix himself, when the whole collection, box, covering letter, wrapper and string, was shovelled into his hands by the almost apoplectic baronet. This was the more fortunate as both men had already tossed the envelopes of their letters into the flames. Bendix, however, merely walked over to the porter's desk and deposited everything there, asking the man to keep the box for him. The porter put the box aside and threw the wrapper into the waste-paper basket. The covering letter had fallen unnoticed from Bendix's hand as he walked across the floor. This the porter tidily picked up a few minutes later and put in the waste-paper basket too, whence, with the wrapper, it was retrieved later by the police. These two articles, it may be said at once, constituted two of the only three tangible clues to the murder, the third, of course, being the chocolates themselves. Of the three unconscious protagonists in the impending tragedy, Sir Eustace was by far the most remarkable. Still a year or two under 50, he looked, with his flaming red face and thick-set figure, a typical country squire of the old school, and both his manners and his language were in accordance with tradition. There were other resemblances too, but they were equally on the surface. The voices of the country squires of the old school were often slightly husky towards late middle age, but it was not with whisky. They hunted, and so did Sir Eustace, with avidity, but the country squires confined their hunting to foxes, and Sir Eustace was far more catholic in his predatory tastes. Sir Eustace, in short, without doubt, was a thoroughly bad baronet. But his vices were all on the large scale, with the usual result that most other men, good or bad, liked him well enough, except perhaps a few husbands here and there or a father or two, and women openly hung on his husky words. In comparison with him, Bendix was rather an ordinary man, a tall, dark, not unhandsome fellow of 28, quiet and somewhat reserved, popular in a way, but neither inviting nor apparently reciprocating anything beyond a somewhat grave friendliness. He had been left a rich man on the death 5 years ago of his father, who had made a fortune out of land sites, which he had bought up in undeveloped areas with an uncanny foresight to sell later, at never less than 10 times what he had given for them, when surrounded by houses and factories erected with other people's money. Just sit tight and let other people make you rich, had been his motto, and a very sound one it proved. His son, though left with an income that precluded any necessity to work, had evidently inherited his father's tendencies, for he had a finger in a good many business pies, just, as he explained a little apologetically, out of sheer love of the most exciting game in the world. Money attracts money. Graham Bendix had inherited it, he made it, and inevitably he married it too. The orphan daughter of a Liverpool ship owner she was, with not far off £500,000 in her own right to bring to Bendix, who needed it not at all. But the money was incidental, for he needed her if not her fortune, and would have married her just as inevitably, said his friends, if she had had not a farthing. She was so exactly his type, a tall, rather serious-minded, highly cultured girl, not so young that her character had not had time to form. She was 25 when Bendix married her 3 years ago. She was the ideal wife for him. A bit of a Puritan, perhaps, in some ways, but Bendix himself was ready enough to be a Puritan by then, if Joan Cullompton was. For in spite of the way he developed later, Bendix had sown as a youth a few wild oats in the normal way. Stage doors, that is to say, had not been entirely strange to him. His name had been mentioned in connection with that of more than one frail and fluffy lady. He had managed, in short, to amuse himself, discreetly, but by no means clandestinely, in the usual manner of young men with too much money and too few years. But all that, again in the ordinary way, had stopped with his marriage. He was openly devoted to his wife and did not care who knew it, while she too, if a trifle less obviously, was equally said to wear her heart on her sleeve. To make no bones about it, the Bendixes had apparently succeeded in achieving that eighth wonder of the modern world, a happy marriage. And into the middle of it there dropped, like a clap of thunder, the box of chocolates. After depositing the box of chocolates with the porter, Moresby continued, shuffling his papers to find the right one, Mr. Bendix followed Sir Eustace into the lounge, where he was reading the Morning Post. Roger nodded approval. There was no other paper that Sir Eustace could possibly have been reading but the Morning Post. Bendix himself proceeded to study the Daily Telegraph. He was rather at a loose end that morning. There were no board meetings for him, and none of the businesses in which he was interested called him out into the rain of a typical November day. He spent the rest of the morning in an aimless way, read the daily papers, glanced through the weeklies, and played 100 up at billiards with another member equally idle. At about 12:30, he went back to lunch to his house in Eaton Square, taking the chocolates with him. Mrs. Bendix had given orders that she would not be in to lunch that day, but her appointment had been cancelled, and she too was lunching at home. Bendix gave her the box of chocolates after the meal, as they were sitting over their coffee in the drawing-room, explaining how they had come into his possession. Mrs. Bendix laughingly teased him about his meanness in not buying her a box, but approved the make and was interested to try the firm's new variety. Joan Bendix was not so serious-minded as not to have a healthy feminine interest in good chocolates. Their appearance, however, did not seem to impress her very much. "Kümmel, Kirsch, maraschino," she said, delving with her fingers among the silver-wrappered sweets, each bearing the name of its filling in neat blue lettering. "Nothing else, apparently. I don't see anything new here, Graham. They've just taken those 3 kinds out of their ordinary liqueur chocolates." "Oh," said Bendix, who was not particularly interested in chocolates. "Well, I don't suppose it matters much. All liqueur chocolates taste the same to me." "Yes, and they've even packed them in their usual liqueur chocolate box," complained his wife, examining the lid. "They're only a sample," Bendix pointed out. "They may not have got the right boxes ready yet." "I don't believe there's the slightest difference," Mrs. Bendix pronounced, unwrapping a Kümmel. She held the box out to her husband. "Have one?" He shook his head. "No, thank you, dear. You know I never eat the things." "Well, you've got to have one of these as a penance for not buying me a proper box. Catch?" She threw him one. As he caught it, she made a wry face. "Oh, I was wrong. These are different. They're 20 times as strong." "Well, they can bear at least that," Bendix smiled, thinking of the usual anemic sweetmeat sold under the name of chocolate liqueur. He put the one she had given him in his mouth and bit it up. A burning taste, not intolerable but far too pronounced to be pleasant, followed the release of the liquid. "By Jove," he exclaimed, "I should think they are strong. I believe they've filled them with neat alcohol." "Oh, they wouldn't do that, surely," said his wife, unwrapping another. "But they are very strong. It must be the new mixture. Really, they almost burn. I'm not sure whether I like them or not. And that Kirsch one tasted far too strongly of almonds. This may be better. You try a maraschino too." To humour her, he swallowed another and disliked it still more. "Funny," he remarked, touching the roof of his mouth with the tip of his tongue. "My tongue feels quite numb." "So did mine at first," she agreed. "Now it's tingling rather. Well, I don't notice any difference between the Kirsch and the maraschino. And they do burn. I can't make up my mind whether I like them or not." "I don't," Bendix said with decision. "I think there's something wrong with them. I shouldn't eat any more if I were you." "Well, they're only an experiment, I suppose," said his wife. A few minutes later, Bendix went out to keep an appointment in the city. He left his wife, still trying to make up her mind whether she liked the chocolates or not, and still eating them to decide. Her last words to him were that they were making her mouth burn again, so much that she was afraid she would not be able to manage any more. "Mr. Bendix remembers that conversation very clearly," said Moresby, looking round at the intent faces, "because it was the last time he saw his wife alive." The conversation in the drawing-room had taken place approximately between 2:15 and 2:30. Bendix kept his appointment in the city at 3, where he stayed for about half an hour, and then took a taxi back to his club for tea. He had been feeling extremely ill during his business talk, and in the taxi he very nearly collapsed. The driver had to summon the porter to help get him out and into the club. They both described him as pale to the point of ghastliness, with staring eyes and livid lips, and his skin damp and clammy. His mind seemed unaffected, however, and once they had got him up the steps he was able to walk, with the help of the porter's arm, into the lounge. The porter, alarmed by his appearance, wanted to send for a doctor at once, but Bendix, who was the last man to make a fuss, absolutely refused to let him, saying that it could only be a bad attack of indigestion and that he would be all right in a few minutes. He must have eaten something that disagreed with him. The porter was doubtful, but left him. Bendix repeated this diagnosis of his own condition a few minutes later to Sir Eustace Pennefather, who was in the lounge at the time, not having left the club at all. But this time Bendix added, "And I believe it was those infernal chocolates you gave me. Now I come to think of it. I thought there was something funny about them at the time. I'd better go and ring up my wife and find out if she's been taken like this too." Sir Eustace, a kind-hearted man, who was no less shocked than the porter at Bendix's appearance, was perturbed by the suggestion that he might in any way be responsible for it, and offered to go and ring up Mrs. Bendix himself, as the other was in no fit condition to move. Bendix was about to reply when a strange change came over him. His body, which had been leaning limply back in his chair, suddenly heaved rigidly upright. His jaws locked together, the livid lips drawn back in a hideous grin, and his hands clenched on the arms of the chair. At the same time, Sir Eustace became aware of an unmistakable smell of bitter almonds. Thoroughly alarmed now, believing indeed that Bendix was dying under his eyes, he raised a shout for the porter and a doctor. There were 2 or 3 other men at the further end of the big room, in which a shout had probably never been heard before in the whole course of its history, and these hurried up at once. Sir Eustace sent one off to tell the porter to get hold of the nearest doctor without a second's delay, and enlisted the others to try to make the convulsed body a little more comfortable. There was no doubt among them that Bendix had taken poison. They spoke to him, asking how he felt and what they could do for him, but he either would not or could not answer. As a matter of fact, he was completely unconscious. Before the doctor had arrived, a telephone message was received from an agitated butler asking if Mr. Bendix was there, and if so, would he come home at once, as Mrs. Bendix had been taken seriously ill. At the house in Eaton Square, matters had been taking much the same course with Mrs. Bendix as with her husband, though a little more rapidly. She remained for half an hour or so in the drawing-room after the latter's departure, during which time she must have eaten about 3 more of the chocolates. She then went up to her bedroom and rang for her maid, to whom she said that she felt very ill and was going to lie down for a time. Like her husband, she ascribed her condition to a violent attack of indigestion. The maid mixed her a draught from a bottle of indigestion powder, which consisted mainly of bicarbonate of soda and bismuth, and brought her a hot water bottle, leaving her lying on the bed. Her description of her mistress's appearance tallied exactly with the porter's and taxi-man's description of Bendix, but unlike them, she did not seem to have been alarmed by it. She admitted later to the opinion that Mrs. Bendix, though anything but a greedy woman, must have overeaten herself at lunch. At 3:15, there was a violent ring from the bell in Mrs. Bendix's room. The girl hurried upstairs and found her mistress apparently in a cataleptic fit, unconscious and rigid. Thoroughly frightened now, she wasted some precious minutes in ineffectual attempts to bring her round, and then hurried downstairs to telephone for the doctor. The practitioner who regularly attended the house was not at home, and it was some time before the butler, who had found the half-hysterical girl at the telephone and taken matters into his own hands, could get into communication with another. By the time the latter did get there, nearly half an hour after Mrs. Bendix's bell had rung, she was past help. Coma had set in in spite of everything the doctor could do, she died in less than 10 minutes after his arrival. She was, in fact, already dead when the butler telephoned to the Rainbow Club. Chapter 3. Dot, dot. Having reached this stage in his narrative, Moresby paused for effect, breath, and refreshment. So far, in spite of the eager interest with which the story had been followed, no fact had been brought out of which his listeners were unaware. It was the police investigations that they wanted to hear, for not only had no details of these been published, but not so much as a hint had been given even as to the theory that was officially held. Perhaps Moresby had gathered something of this sentiment, for after a moment's rest he resumed with a slight smile. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I shan't keep you much longer with these preliminaries, but it's just as well to run through everything while we're on it, if we want to get a view of the case as a whole. As you know, then, Mr. Bendix himself did not die. Luckily for himself, he had eaten only 2 of the chocolates, as against his wife's 7, but still more luckily he had fallen into the hands of a clever doctor. By the time her doctor saw Mrs. Bendix, it was too late for him to do anything, but the smaller amount of poison that Mr. Bendix had swallowed meant that its progress was not so rapid, and the doctor had time to save him. Not that the doctor knew then what the poison was. He treated him chiefly for prussic acid poisoning, thinking from the symptoms and the smell that Mr. Bendix must have taken oil of bitter almonds, but he wasn't sure and threw in 1 or 2 other things as well. Anyhow, it turned out in the end that he couldn't have had a fatal dose, and he was conscious again by about 8 o'clock that night. They'd put him into one of the club bedrooms, and by the next day he was convalescent. At first, Moresby went on to explain, it was thought at Scotland Yard that Mrs. Bendix's death and her husband's narrow escape were due to a terrible accident. The police had, of course, taken the matter in hand as soon as the woman's death was reported to them and the fact of poison established. In due course, a district detective inspector arrived at the Rainbow Club, and as soon as the doctor would permit after Bendix's recovery of consciousness, held an interview with the still very sick man. The fact of his wife's death was kept from him in his doubtful condition, and he was questioned solely upon his own experience, for it was already clear that the 2 cases were bound up together, and light on one would equally clarify the other. The inspector told Bendix bluntly that he had been poisoned and pressed him as to how the stuff could have been taken. Could he account for it in any way? It was not long before the chocolates came into Bendix's mind. He mentioned their burning taste, and he mentioned having already spoken to Sir Eustace about them as the possible cause of his illness. This the inspector already knew. He had spent the time before Bendix came round in interviewing such people as had come into contact with him since his return to the club that afternoon. He had heard the porter's story, and he had taken steps to trace the taximan. He had spoken with the members who had gathered round Bendix in the lounge, and Sir Eustace had reported to him the remark of Bendix about the chocolates. The inspector had not attached very much importance to this at the moment, but simply as a matter of routine had questioned Sir Eustace closely as to the whole episode, and again as a matter of routine had afterwards rummaged through the wastepaper basket and extricated the wrapper and the covering letter. Still as a matter of routine, and still not particularly impressed, he now proceeded to question Bendix on the same topic, and then at last began to realize its significance as he heard how the 2 had shared the chocolates after lunch, and how, even before Bendix had left home, the wife had eaten more than the husband. The doctor now intervened, and the inspector had to leave the sick room. His first action was to telephone to his colleague at the Bendix home and tell him to take possession without delay of the box of chocolates which was probably still in the drawing room. At the same time, he asked for a rough idea of the number of chocolates that were missing. The other told him 9 or 10. The inspector, who on Bendix's information had only accounted for 6 or 7, rang off and telephoned what he had learnt to Scotland Yard. Interest was now centred on the chocolates. They were taken to Scotland Yard that evening and sent off at once to be analysed. Well, the doctor hadn't been far wrong, said Moresby. The poison in those chocolates wasn't oil of bitter almonds, As a matter of fact, it was nitrobenzene, but I understand that isn't so very different. If any of you ladies or gentlemen have a knowledge of chemicals, you'll know more about the stuff than I do. But I believe it's used occasionally in the cheaper sorts of confectionery, less than it used to be though, to give an almond flavor as a substitute for oil of bitter almonds, which I needn't tell you is a powerful poison too. But the most usual way of employing nitrobenzene commercially is in the manufacture of aniline dyes. When the analyst's preliminary report came through, Scotland Yard's initial theory of accidental death was strengthened. Here definitely was a poison used in the manufacture of chocolates and other sweets. A terrible mistake must have been made. The firm had been employing the stuff as a cheap substitute for genuine liqueurs, and too much of it had been used. The fact that the only liqueurs named on the silver wrappings were maraschino, Kümmel, and kirsch, all of which carry a greater or lesser flavor of almonds, supported this conception. But before the firm was approached by the police for an explanation, other facts had come to light. It was found that only the top layer of chocolates contained any poison. Those in the lower layer were completely free from anything harmful. Moreover, in the lower layer, the fillings inside the chocolate cases corresponded with the description on the wrappings, whereas in the top layer, besides the poison, each sweet contained a blend of the three liqueurs mentioned, and not, for instance, plain maraschino and poison. It was further remarked that no maraschino, kirsch, or Kümmel was to be found in the two lower layers. The interesting fact also emerged in the analyst's detailed report that each chocolate in the top layer contained, in addition to its blend of the three liqueurs, exactly 6 minims of nitrobenzene, no more and no less. The cases were a fair size, and there was plenty of room for quite a considerable quantity of the liqueur blend, besides this fixed quantity of poison. This was significant. Still more so was the further fact that in the bottom of each of the noxious chocolates there were distinct traces of a hole having been drilled in the case and subsequently plugged up with a piece of melted chocolate. It was now plain to the police that foul play was in question. A deliberate attempt had been made to murder Sir Eustace Pennefather. The would-be murderer had acquired a box of Mason's chocolate liqueurs, separated those in which a flavor of almonds would not come amiss, drilled a small hole in each and drained it of its contents, injected, probably with a fountain pen filler, the dose of poison, filled the cavity up from the mixture of former fillings, carefully stopped the hole and rewrapped it in its silver paper covering. A meticulous business, meticulously carried out. The covering letter and wrapper which had arrived with the box of chocolates now became of paramount importance, and the inspector who had had the foresight to rescue these from destruction had occasion to pat himself on the back. Together with the box itself and the remaining chocolates, they formed the only material clues to this cold-blooded murder. Taking them with him, the chief inspector now in charge of the case called on the managing director of Mason and Sons, and without informing him of the circumstances as to how it had come into his possession, laid the letter before him and invited him to explain certain points in connection with it. How many of these, the managing director was asked, had been sent out, who knew of this one, and who could have had a chance of handling the box that was sent to Sir Eustace? If the police had hoped to surprise Mr. Mason, the result was nothing compared with the way in which Mr. Mason surprised the police. "Well, sir?" prompted the chief inspector, when it seemed as if Mr. Mason would go on examining the letter all day. Mr. Mason adjusted his glasses to the angle for examining chief inspectors instead of letters. He was a small, rather fierce, elderly man who had begun life in a back street in Huddersfield and did not intend anyone to forget it. "Where the devil did you get this?" he asked. The papers, it must be remembered, had not yet got hold of the sensational aspect of Mrs. Bendix's death. "I came," replied the chief inspector with dignity, "to ask you about your sending it out, sir, not tell you about my getting hold of it." "Then you can go to the devil," replied Mr. Mason with decision. "And take Scotland Yard with you," he added, by way of a comprehensive afterthought. "I must warn you, sir," said the chief inspector, somewhat taken aback but concealing the fact beneath his weightiest manner. "I must warn you that it may be a serious matter for you to refuse to answer my questions." Mr. Mason, it appeared, was exasperated rather than intimidated by this covert threat. "Get out of my office," he replied in his native tongue. "Are you druffin', man? Or do you just think you're funny? You know as well as I do that that letter was never sent out from here." It was then that the chief inspector became surprised. Not sent out by your firm at all," he yammered. It was a possibility that had not occurred to him. "It's forged, then?" "Isn't that what I'm telling you?" growled the old man, regarding him fiercely from under bushy brows. But the chief inspector's evident astonishment had mollified him somewhat. "Sir," said that official, "I must ask you to be good enough to answer my questions as fully as possible. It's a case of murder I'm investigating, and—" he paused and thought cunningly, "and the murderer seems to have been making free use of your business to cloak his operations." The cunning of the chief inspector prevailed. "The devil he has!" roared the old man. "Damn the blackguard! Ask any questions thou wants, lad. I'll answer right enough." Communication thus being established, the chief inspector proceeded to get to grips. During the next 5 minutes, his heart sank lower and lower. In place of the simple case, he had anticipated it became rapidly plain to him that the affair was going to be very difficult indeed. Hitherto, he had thought, and his superiors had agreed with him, that the case was going to prove one of sudden temptation. Somebody in the Mason firm had a grudge against Sir Eustace. Into his, or more probably, as the chief inspector had considered, her hands had fallen the box and letter addressed to him. The opportunity had been obvious. The means, in the shape of nitrobenzene in use in the factory, ready to hand. The result had followed. Such a culprit would be easy enough to trace. But now, it seemed, this pleasant theory must be abandoned, for in the first place no such letter as this had ever been sent out at all. The firm had produced no new brand of chocolates. If they had done so, it was not their custom to dispense sample boxes among private individuals. The letter was a forgery. But the notepaper, on the other hand, and this was the only remnant left to support the theory, was perfectly genuine, so far as the old man could tell. He could not say for certain, but was almost sure that this was a piece of old stock which had been finished up about 6 months ago. The heading might be forged, but he did not think so. "6 months ago?" queried the inspector unhappily. "About that," said the other, and plucked a piece of paper out of a stand in front of him. "This is what we use now." The inspector examined it. There was no doubt of the difference. The new paper was thinner and more glossy, but the heading looked exactly the same. The inspector took a note of the firm who had printed both. Unfortunately, no sample of the old paper was available. Mr. Mason had a search made on the spot, but not a sheet was left. As a matter of fact, Moresby now said, it had been noticed that the piece of paper on which the letter was written was an old one. It is distinctly yellow round the edges. I'll pass it round, and you can see for yourselves. Please be careful of it. The bit of paper, once handled by a murderer, passed slowly from each would-be detective to his neighbour. "Well, to cut a long story shorter," Moresby went on, "we had it examined by the firm of printers, Webster's, in Frith Street, and they're prepared to swear that it's their work. That means the paper was genuine. Worse luck." "You mean, of course," put in Sir Charles Wildman impressively, "that had the heading been a copy, the task of discovering the printers who executed it should have been comparatively simple." "That's correct, Sir Charles. Except if it had been done by somebody who owned a small press of their own, but that would have been traceable too. All we've actually got is that the murderer is someone who had access to Mason's notepaper up to 6 months ago. And that's pretty wide." "Do you think it was stolen with the actual intention of putting it to the purpose for which it was used?" asked Alicia Dammers. "It seems like it, madam, and something kept holding the murderer up." As regards the wrapper, Mr. Mason had been unable to help at all. This consisted simply of a piece of ordinary thin brown paper, such as could be bought anywhere, with Sir Eustace's name and address hand-printed on it in neat capitals. Apparently there was nothing to be learnt from it at all. The postmark showed that it had been dispatched by the 9:30 p.m. post from the post office in Southampton Street, Strand. There is a collection at 8:30 and another at 9:30, Moresby explained, so it must have been posted between those two times. The packet was quite small enough to go into the opening for letters. The stamps make up the right value. The post office was shut by then, so it could not have been handed in over the counter. Perhaps you'd care to see it. The piece of brown paper was handed gravely round. "Have you brought the box too, and the other chocolates?" asked Mrs. Fielder Fleming. "No, madam. It was one of Mason's ordinary boxes, and the chocolates have all been used for analysis." "Oh!" Mrs. Fielder Fleming was plainly disappointed. "I thought there might be fingerprints on it," she explained. "We have already looked for those," replied Moresby without a flicker. There was a pause while the wrapper passed from hand to hand. "Naturally, we've made inquiries as to anyone seen posting a packet in Southampton Street between 8:30 and 9:30, Moresby continued, but without result. We've also carefully interrogated Sir Eustace Pennefather to discover whether he could throw any light on the question why anyone should wish to take his life, or who. Sir Eustace can't give us the faintest idea. Of course, we followed up the usual line of inquiry as to who would benefit by his death, but without any helpful results. Most of his possessions go to his wife, who has a divorce suit pending against him, and she's out of the country. We've checked her movements, and she's out of the question. Besides, added Moresby unprofessionally, she's a very nice lady. And as to facts, all we know is that the murderer probably had some connection with Mason and Sons up to 6 months ago, and was almost certainly in Southampton Street at some time between 8:30 and 9:30 on that particular evening. I'm very much afraid we're up against a brick wall." Moresby did not add that so were the amateur criminologists in front of him too, but he very distinctly implied it. There was a silence. "Is that all?" asked Roger. "That's all, Mr. Sheringham," Moresby agreed. There was another silence. "Surely the police have a theory," Mr. Morton Harrogate Bradley threw out in a detached manner. Moresby hesitated perceptibly. "Come along, Moresby," Roger encouraged him. "It's quite a simple theory. I know it." "Well," said Moresby, thus stimulated, "we're inclined to believe that the crime was the work of a lunatic, or semi-lunatic, possibly quite unknown personally to Sir Eustace. You see—" Moresby looked a trifle embarrassed. "You see," he went on bravely, "Sir Eustace's life was a bit, well, we might say hectic, if you'll excuse the word. We think at the Yard that some religious or social maniac took it on himself to rid the world of him, so to speak. Some of his escapades had caused a bit of talk, as you may know. Or it might just be a plain homicidal lunatic who likes killing people at a distance. There's the Horwood case, you see. Some lunatic sent poisoned chocolates to the Commissioner of Police himself. That caused a lot of attention. We think this case may be an echo of it. A case that creates a good deal of notice is quite often followed by another on exactly the same lines, as I needn't remind you. Well, that's our theory, and if it's the right one, we've got about as much chance of laying our hands on the murderer as... Chief Inspector Moresby cast about for something really scathing. "As we have," suggested Roger. Chapter 4. ... The circle sat on for some time after Moresby had gone. There was a lot to discuss, and everybody had views to put forward, suggestions to make, and theories to advance. One thing emerged with singular unanimity. The police had been working on the wrong lines. Their theory must be mistaken. This was not a casual murder by a chance lunatic. Somebody very definite had gone methodically about the business of helping Sir Eustace out of the world, and that somebody had behind him an equally definite motive. Like almost all murders, in fact, it was a matter of chercher le motif. On the exposition and discussion of theories, Roger kept a firmly quelling hand. The whole object of the experiment, as he pointed out more than once, was that everybody should work independently, without bias from any other brain, form his or her own theory, and set about proving it in his or her own way. "But oughtn't we to pool our facts, Sheringham?" boomed Sir Charles. "I should suggest that though we pursue our investigations independently, any new facts we discover should be placed at once at the disposal of all. The exercise should be a mental one, not a competition in routine detection. There's a lot to be said for that view, Sir Charles, Roger agreed. In fact, I've thought it over very carefully, but on the whole, I think it will be better if we keep any new facts to ourselves after this evening. You see, we're already in possession of all the facts that the police have discovered, and anything else we may come across isn't likely to be so much a definite pointer to the murderer as some little thing, quite insignificant in itself, to support a particular theory. Sir Charles grunted, obviously unconvinced. "I'm quite willing to have it put to the vote," Roger said handsomely. A vote was taken. Sir Charles and Mrs. Fielder Fleming voted for all facts being disclosed. Mr. Bradley, Alicia Dammers, Mr. Chitterwick, the last after considerable hesitation. And Roger voted against. "We retain our own facts," Roger said, and made a mental note of who had voted for each. He was inclined to guess that the voting indicated pretty correctly who was going to be content with general theorizing, and who was ready to enter so far into the spirit of the game as to go out and work for it. Or it might simply show who already had a theory and who had not. Sir Charles accepted the result with resignation. "We start equal as from now then," he announced. "As from the moment we leave this room," amended Morton Harrogate Bradley, rearranging the set of his tie. "But I agree so far with Sir Charles's proposition as to think that anyone who can at this moment add anything to the Chief Inspector's statement should do so." "But can anyone?" asked Mrs. Fielder Fleming. "Sir Charles knows Mr. and Mrs. Bendix," Alicia Dammers pointed out impartially. "And Sir Eustace. And I know Sir Eustace too, of course." Roger smiled. This statement was a characteristic meiosis on the part of Miss Dammers. Everybody knew that Miss Dammers had been the only woman, so far as rumour recorded, who had ever turned the tables on Sir Eustace Pennefather. Sir Eustace had taken it into his head to add the scalp of an intellectual woman to those other rather unintellectual ones which already dangled at his belt. Alicia Dammers, with her good looks, her tall, slim figure, and her irreproachable sartorial taste, had satisfied his very fastidious requirements so far as feminine appearance was concerned. He had laid himself out to fascinate. The results had been watched by the large circle of Miss Dammers's friends with considerable joy. Miss Dammers had apparently been only too ready to be fascinated. It seemed that she was living entirely on the point of succumbing to Sir Eustace's blandishments. They had dined, visited, lunched, and made excursions together without respite. Sir Eustace, stimulated by the daily prospect of surrender on the following one, had exercised his ardour with every art he knew. Miss Dammers had then retired serenely, and the next autumn published a book in which Sir Eustace Pennefather, dissected to the last ligament, was given to the world in all the naked unpleasingness of his psychological anatomy. Miss Dammers never talked about her art, because she was a really brilliant writer, and not just pretending to be one, but she certainly held that everything had to be sacrificed, including the feelings of the Sir Eustace Pennefathers of this world, to whatever god she worshipped privately in place of it. Mr. and Mrs. Bendix are quite incidental to the crime, of course, from the murderer's point of view, Mr. Bradley now pointed out to her, in the gentle tones of one instructing a child that the letter A is followed in the alphabet by the letter B. So far as we know, their only connection with Sir Eustace is that he and Bendix both belong to the Rainbow. "I needn't give you my opinion of Sir Eustace," remarked Miss Dammers. "Those of you who have read Flesh and the Devil know how I saw him, and I have no reason to suppose that he has changed since I was studying him, but I claim no infallibility. It would be interesting to hear whether Sir Charles's opinion coincides with mine or not." Sir Charles, who had not read Flesh and the Devil, looked a little embarrassed. "Well, I don't see that I can add much to the impression the Chief Inspector gave of him. I don't know the man well, and certainly have no wish to do so." Everybody looked extremely innocent. It was common gossip that there had been the possibility of an engagement between Sir Eustace and Sir Charles's only daughter, and that Sir Charles had not viewed the prospect with any perceptible joy. It was further known that the engagement had even been prematurely announced and promptly denied the next day. Sir Charles tried to look as innocent as everybody else. As the Chief Inspector hinted, he is something of a bad lot. Some people might go so far as to call him a blackguard. Women, explained Sir Charles bluntly. And he drinks too much, he added. It was plain that Sir Charles Wildman did not approve of Sir Eustace Pennefather. I can add one small point of purely psychological value, amplified Alicia Dammers, but it shows the dullness of his reactions. Even in the short time since the tragedy, rumour has joined the name of Sir Eustace to that of a fresh woman. I was somewhat surprised to hear that, added Miss Dammers dryly. I should have been inclined to give him credit for being a little more upset by the terrible mistake and its fortunate consequences to himself, even though Mrs. Bendix was a total stranger to him. Yes, by the way, I should have corrected that impression earlier, observed Sir Charles. Mrs. Bendix was not a total stranger to Sir Eustace, though he may probably have forgotten ever meeting her. But he did. I was talking to Mrs. Bendix one evening at a first night, I forget the play, and Sir Eustace came up to me. I introduced them, mentioning something about Bendix being a member of the Rainbow. I'd almost forgotten. Then I'm afraid I was completely wrong about him, said Miss Dammers, chagrined. I was far too kind. To be too kind in the dissecting room was evidently, in Miss Dammers' opinion, a far greater crime than being too unkind. As for Bendix, said Sir Charles rather vaguely, I don't know that I can add anything to your knowledge of him. Quite a decent, steady fellow. Had not turned by his money in the least, rich as he is. His wife, too, charming woman. A little serious, perhaps. Sort of woman who likes sitting on committees. Not that that's anything against her, though. Rather the reverse, I should have said, observed Miss Dammers, who liked sitting on committees herself. Quite, said Sir Charles hastily, remembering Miss Dammers' curious predilections. And she wasn't too serious to make a bet, evidently, although it was a trifling one. She had another bet that she knew nothing about, chanted in solemn tones Mrs. Fielder Fleming, who was already pondering the dramatic possibilities of the situation. Not a trifling one, a grim one. It was with death, and she lost it. Mrs. Fielder Fleming was regrettably inclined to carry her dramatic sense into her ordinary life. It did not go at all well with her culinary aspect. She eyed Alicia Dammers covertly, wondering whether she could get in with a play before that lady cut the ground away from under her with a book. Roger, as chairman, took steps to bring the discussion back to relevancies. Yes, poor woman. But after all, we mustn't let ourselves confuse the issue. It's rather difficult to remember that the murdered person has no connection with the crime at all, so to speak, but there it is. Just by accident, the wrong person died. It's on Sir Eustace that we have to concentrate. Now, does anybody else here know Sir Eustace, or anything about him, or any other fact bearing on the crime? Nobody responded. Then we're all on the same footing. And now, about our next meeting. I suggest that we have a clear week for formulating our theories and carrying out any investigations we think necessary, that we then meet on consecutive evenings, beginning with next Monday, and that we now draw lots as to the order in which we are to read our several papers or give our conclusions. Or does anyone think we should have more than one speaker each evening? After a little talk, it was decided to meet again on Monday, that day week, and for purposes of fuller discussion, allot one evening to each member. Lots were then drawn, with the result that members were to speak in the following order: 1. Sir Charles Wildman, 2. Mrs. Fielder Fleming, 3. Mr. Morton Harrogate Bradley, 4. Roger Sheringham, 5. Alicia Dammers, and 6. Mr. Ambrose Chitterwick. Mr. Chitterwick brightened considerably when his name was announced as last on the list. By that time, he confided to Morton Harrogate, somebody is quite sure to have discovered the right solution, and I shall therefore not have to give my own conclusions. If indeed, he added dubiously, I ever reach any. Tell me, how does a detective really set to work? Mr. Bradley smiled kindly and promised to lend Mr. Chitterwick one of his own books. Mr. Chitterwick, who had read them all and possessed most of them, thanked him very gratefully. Before the meeting finally broke up, Mrs. Fielder Fleming could not resist one more opportunity of being mildly dramatic. How strange life is, she sighed across the table to Sir Charles. I actually saw Mrs. Bendix and her husband in their box at the Imperial the night before she died. Oh yes, I knew them by sight. They often came to my first nights. I was in a stall almost directly under their box. Indeed, life is certainly stranger than fiction. If I could have guessed for 1 minute at the dreadful fate hanging over her, I— You'd have had the sense to warn her to steer clear of chocolates, I hope, observed Sir Charles, who did not hold very much with Mrs. Fielder Fleming. The meeting then broke up. Roger returned to his rooms in the Albany, feeling exceedingly pleased with himself. He had a suspicion that the various attempts at a solution were going to be almost as interesting to him as the problem itself. Nevertheless, he was on his mettle. He had not been very lucky in the draw and would have preferred the place of Mr. Chitterwick, which would have meant that he would have the advantage of already knowing the results achieved by his rivals before having to disclose his own. Not that he intended to rely on others' brains in the least. Like Mr. Morton Harrogate Bradley, he already had a theory of his own, but it would have been pleasant to be able to weigh up and criticize the efforts of Sir Charles, Mr. Bradley, and particularly Alicia Dammers. To these three he gave credit for possessing the best minds in the circle before irrevocably committing himself. And more than any other crime in which he had been interested, it seemed to him he wanted to find the right solution of this one. To his surprise, when he got back to his rooms, he found Moresby waiting in his sitting room. "Ah, Mr. Sheringham," said that cautious official. "Thought you wouldn't mind me waiting here for a word with you. Not in a great hurry to go to bed, are you?" "Not in the least," said Roger, doing things with a decanter and siphon. "It's early yet. Say when." Moresby looked discreetly the other way. When they were settled in two huge leather armchairs before the fire, Moresby explained himself. "As a matter of fact, Mr. Sheringham, the chiefs deputed me to keep a sort of unofficial eye on you and your friends over this business. Not that we don't trust you, or think you won't be discreet, or anything like that, but it's better for us to know just what's going on with a mass detective attack like this. So that if any of us finds out something really important, you can nip in first and make use of it," Roger smiled. "Yes, I quite see the official point." "So that we can take measures to prevent the bird from being scared," Moresby corrected reproachfully. "That's all, Mr. Sheringham." "Is it?" said Roger, with unconcealed skepticism. "But you don't think it very likely that your protecting hand will be required, eh, Moresby?" "Frankly, sir, I don't. We're not in the habit of giving up a case so long as we think there's the least chance of finding the criminal. And Detective Inspector Farrar, who's been in charge of this one, is a capable man. And that's his theory, that it's the work of some criminal lunatic, quite untraceable." "That's the opinion he's been led to form, Mr. Sheringham, sir. But there's no harm in your circle amusing themselves," added Moresby magnanimously, "if they want to, and they've got the time to waste." "Well, well," said Roger, refusing to be drawn. They smoked their pipes in silence for a few minutes. "Come along, Moresby," Roger said gently. The chief inspector looked at him with an expression that indicated nothing but bland surprise. "Sir?" Roger shook his head. "It won't wash, Moresby. It won't wash. Come along now. Out with it." "Out with what, Mr. Sheringham?" queried Moresby, the picture of innocent bewilderment. "Your real reason for coming round here," Roger said nastily. "Wanted to pump me, for the benefit of that effete institution you represent, I suppose. Well, I warn you, there's nothing doing this time. I know you better than I did 18 months ago at Ludmouth, remember?" "Well, what can have put such an idea as that into your head, Mr. Sheringham, sir?" positively gasped that much misunderstood man, Chief Inspector Moresby of Scotland Yard. "I came round because I thought you might like to ask me a few questions, to give you a leg up in finding the murderer before any of your friends could. That's all." Roger laughed. "Moresby, I like you. You're a bright spot in a dull world. I expect you try to persuade the very criminals you arrest that it hurts you more than it does them, and I shouldn't be at all surprised if you don't somehow make them believe it. Very well. If that's all you came round for, I'll ask you some questions, and thank you very much. Tell me this, then. Who do you think was trying to murder Sir Eustace Pennefather?" Moresby sipped delicately at his whisky and soda. "You know what I think, Mr. Sheringham, sir." "Indeed I don't," Roger retorted. "I only know what you've told me you think." I haven't been in charge of the case at all, Mr. Sheringham, Moresby hedged. Who do you really think was trying to murder Sir Eustace Pennefather? Roger repeated patiently. Is it your own opinion that the official police theory is right or wrong? Driven into a corner, Moresby allowed himself the novelty of speaking his unofficial mind. He smiled covertly, as if at a secret thought. Well, Mr. Sheringham, sir, he said with deliberation, our theory is a useful one, isn't it? I mean, it gives us every excuse for not finding the murderer. We can hardly be expected to be in touch with every half-baked creature in the country who may have homicidal impulses. Our theory will be put forward at the conclusion of the adjourned inquest in about a fortnight's time, with reason and evidence to support it, and any evidence to the contrary not mentioned, and you'll see that the coroner will agree with it, and the jury will agree with it, and the papers will agree with it, and everyone will say that, really, the police can't be blamed for not catching the murderer this time, and everybody will be happy. Except Mr. Bendix, who doesn't get his wife's murder avenged, added Roger. Moresby, you're being positively sarcastic, and from all this, I deduce that you personally will stand aside from this general and amicable agreement. Do you think the case has been badly handled by your people? Roger's last question followed so closely on the heels of his previous remarks that Moresby had answered it almost before he had time to reflect on the possible indiscretion of doing so. No, Mr. Sheringham, I don't think that. Farrar's a capable man, and he'd leave no stone unturned. No stone, I mean, that he could turn. Moresby paused significantly. Ah, said Roger. Having committed himself to this lamb, Moresby seemed disposed to look about for a sheep. He resettled himself in his chair and recklessly drank a gill from his tumbler. Roger, scarcely daring to breathe too audibly for fear of scaring the sheep, studiously examined the fire. You see, this is a very difficult case, Mr. Sheringham, Moresby pronounced. Farrar had an open mind, of course, when he took it up, and he kept an open mind even after he'd found out that Sir Eustace was even a bit more of a daisy than he'd imagined at first. That is to say, he never lost sight of the fact that it might have been some outside lunatic who sent those chocolates to Sir Eustace, just out of a general socialistic or religious feeling that he'd be doing a favour to society or heaven by putting him out of the world. A fanatic, you might say. Murder from conviction, Roger murmured. Yes? But naturally, what Farrar was concentrating on was Sir Eustace's private life, and that's where we police officers are handicapped. It's not easy for us to make inquiries into the private life of a baronet. Nobody wants to be helpful. Everybody seems anxious to put a spoke in our wheel. Every line that looked hopeful to Farrar led to a dead end. Sir Eustace himself told him to go to the devil and made no bones about it. Naturally, from his point of view, Roger said thoughtfully, the last thing he'd want would be a sheaf of his peccadilloes laid out for a harvest festival in court. Yes, and Mrs. Bendix lying in her grave on account of them, retorted Moresby with asperity. No, he was responsible for her death, though indirectly enough, I'll admit, and it was up to him to be as helpful as he could to the police officer investigating the case. But there Farrar was. Couldn't get any further. He unearthed a scandal or two, it's true, but they led to nothing. So, well, he hasn't admitted this, Mr. Sheringham, and you'll realize I ought not to be telling you. It's to go no further than this room, mind. Good heavens, no, Roger said eagerly. Well then, it's my private opinion that Farrar was driven to the other conclusion in self-defense, and the chief had to agree with it in self-defense too. But if you want to get to the bottom of the business, Mr. Sheringham, and nobody would be more pleased if you did than Farrar himself, my advice to you is to concentrate on Sir Eustace's private life. You've a better chance than any of us there. You're on his level, you'll know members of his club, you'll know his friends personally, and the friends of his friends. And that, concluded Moresby, is the tip I really came round to give you. That's very decent of you, Moresby, Roger said with warmth. Very decent indeed. Have another spot. Well, thank you, Mr. Sheringham, sir, said Chief Inspector Moresby. I don't mind if I do. Roger was meditating as he mixed the drinks. I believe you're right, Moresby, he said slowly. In fact, I've been thinking along those lines ever since I read the first full account. The truth lies in Sir Eustace's private life, I feel sure. And if I were superstitious, which I'm not, do you know what I should believe? That the murderer's aim misfired, and Sir Eustace escaped death for an express purpose of Providence, so that he, the destined victim, should be the ironical instrument of bringing his own intended murderer to justice. "Well, Mr. Sheringham, would you really?" said the sarcastic chief inspector, who was not superstitious either. Roger seemed rather taken with the idea. Chance, the Avenger. Make a good film title, wouldn't it? But there's a terrible lot of truth in it. How often don't you people at the yard stumble on some vital piece of evidence out of pure chance? How often isn't it that you're led to the right solution by what seems a series of mere coincidences? I'm not belittling your detective work, but just think how often a piece of brilliant detective work, which has led you most of the way but not the last vital few inches, meets with some remarkable stroke of sheer luck, thoroughly well-deserved luck, no doubt, but luck, which just makes the case complete for you. I can think of scores of instances. The Milsom and Fowler murder, for example. Don't you see what I mean? Is it chance every time, or is it Providence avenging the victim? "Well, Mr. Sheringham," said Chief Inspector Moresby, "to tell you the truth, I don't mind what it is, so long as it lets me put my hands on the right man." "Moresby," laughed Roger, "you're hopeless." Chapter 5. Sir Charles Wildman, as he had said, cared more for honest facts than for psychological fiddle-faddle. Facts were very dear to Sir Charles. More, they were meat and drink to him. His income of roughly £30,000 a year was derived entirely from the masterful way in which he was able to handle facts. There was no one at the bar who could so convincingly distort an honest but awkward fact into carrying an entirely different interpretation from that which any ordinary person, counsel for the prosecution, for instance, would have put upon it. He could take that fact, look it boldly in the face, twist it round, read a message from the back of its neck, turn it inside out, and detect auguries in its entrails, dance triumphantly on its corpse, pulverize it completely, remold it if necessary into an utterly different shape, and finally, if the fact still had the temerity to retain any vestige of its primary aspect, bellow at it in the most terrifying manner. If that failed, he was quite prepared to weep at it in open court. No wonder that Sir Charles Wildman, K.C., was paid that amount of money every year to transform facts of menacing appearance to his clients into so many sucking doves, each cooing those very clients' tender innocence. If the reader is interested in statistics, it might be added that the number of murderers whom Sir Charles, in the course of his career, had saved from the gallows, if placed one on top of the other, would have reached to a very great height indeed. Sir Charles Wildman had rarely appeared for the prosecution. It is not considered etiquette for prosecuting counsel to bellow, and there is scant need for their tears. His bellowing and his public tears were Sir Charles Wildman's long suit. He was one of the old school, one of its very last representatives, and he found that the old school paid him handsomely. When therefore he looked impressively round the crime circle on its next meeting, 1 week after Roger had put forward his proposal, and adjusted the gold-rimmed pince-nez on his somewhat massive nose, the other members could feel no doubt as to the quality of the entertainment in store for them. After all, they were going to enjoy for nothing what amounted to 1,000-guinea brief for the prosecution. Sir Charles glanced at the notepad in his hand and cleared his throat. No barrister could clear his throat quite so ominously as Sir Charles. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began in weighty tones, "it is not unnatural that I should have been more interested in this murder than perhaps anyone else, for personal reasons which will no doubt have occurred to you already. Sir Eustace Pennefather's name, as you must know, has been mentioned in connection with that of my daughter, and though the report of their engagement was not merely premature, but utterly without foundation, it is inevitable that I should feel some personal connection, however slight, with this attempt to assassinate a man who has been mentioned as a possible son-in-law to myself. I do not wish to stress this personal aspect of the case, which otherwise I have tried to view as impersonally as any other with which I have been connected, but I put it forward more as an excuse than anything, for it has enabled me to approach the problem set us by our president with a more intimate knowledge of the persons concerned than the rest of you could have, and with, too, I fear, information at my disposal which goes a long way towards indicating the truth of this mystery. I know that I should have placed this information at the disposal of my fellow members last week, and I apologize to them wholeheartedly for not having done so, but the truth is that I did not realize then that this knowledge of mine was in any way germane to the solution or even remotely helpful, and it is only since I began to ponder over the case with a view to clearing up the tragic tangle that the vital import of this information has impressed itself upon me. Sir Charles paused and allowed his resounding periods to echo round the room. "Now, with its help," he pronounced, looking severely from face to face, "I am of opinion that I have read this riddle." A twitter of excitement, no less genuine because obviously awaited, ran round the faithful circle. Sir Charles whisked off his pince-nez and swung them, in a characteristic gesture, on their broad ribbon. "Yes, I think, in fact I am sure, that I am about to elucidate this dark business to you. And for this reason I regret that the lot has fallen upon me to speak first. It would have been more interesting, perhaps, had we been permitted to examine some other theories first, and demonstrate their falsity before we probe to the truth. That is, assuming that there are other theories to examine. It would not surprise me, however, to learn that you had all leapt to the conclusion to which I have been driven. Not in the least. I claim no extraordinary powers in allowing the facts to speak to me for themselves. I pride myself on no superhuman insight in having been able to see further into this dark business than our official solvers of mysteries and readers of strange riddles, the trained detective force. Very much the reverse. I am only an ordinary human being, endowed with no more powers than any of my fellow creatures. It would not astonish me for an instant to be apprised that I am only following in the footsteps of others of you in fixing the guilt on the individual who did, as I submit I am about to prove to you beyond any possibility of doubt, commit this foul crime. Having thus provided for the improbable contingency of some other member of the circle having been so clever as himself, Sir Charles cut some of the cackle and got down to business. I set about this matter with one question in my mind, and one only, the question to which the right answer has proved a sure guide to the criminal in almost every murder that has ever been committed. The question which hardly any criminal can avoid leaving behind him, damning though he knows the answer must be. The question, cui bono? Sir Charles allowed a pregnant moment of silence. Who, he translated obligingly, was the gainer? Who, he paraphrased, for the benefit of any possible half-wits in his audience, would, to put it bluntly, score by the death of Sir Eustace Pennefather? He darted looks of inquiry from under his tufted eyebrows, but his hearers dutifully played the game. Nobody undertook to enlighten him prematurely. Sir Charles was far too practised a rhetorician to enlighten them prematurely himself. Leaving the question as an immense query mark in their minds, he veered off on another track. Now there were, as I saw it, only 3 definite clues in this crime, he continued, in almost conversational tones. I refer, of course, to the forged letter, the wrapper, and the chocolates themselves. Of these, the wrapper could only be helpful so far as its postmark. The hand-printed address I dismissed as useless. It could have been done by anyone, at any time. It led, I felt, nowhere, and I could not see that the chocolates or the box that contained them were of the least use as evidence. I may be wrong, but I could not see it. They were specimens of a well-known brand, on sale at hundreds of shops. It would be fruitless to attempt to trace their purchaser. Moreover, any possibilities in that direction would quite certainly have been explored already by the police. I was left, in short, with only 2 pieces of material evidence, the forged letter and the postmark on the wrapper, on which the whole structure of proof must be erected. Sir Charles paused again, to let the magnitude of this task sink into the minds of the others. Apparently he had overlooked the fact that his problem must have been common to all. Roger, who with difficulty had remained silent so long, interposed a gentle question. Had you already made up your mind as to the criminal, Sir Charles? I had already answered to my own satisfaction the question I had posed to myself, to which I made reference a few minutes ago, replied Sir Charles, with dignity but without explicitness. I see. You had made up your mind, Roger pinned him down. It would be interesting to know, so that we can follow better your way of approaching the proof. You used inductive methods, then? Possibly, said Sir Charles testily. Sir Charles strongly disliked being pinned down. He glowered for a moment in silence to recover from this indignity. The task, I saw at once, he resumed in a sterner voice, was not going to be an easy one. The period at my disposal was extremely limited. Far-reaching inquiries were obviously necessary. My own time was far too closely engaged to permit me to make, in person, any investigations I might find advisable. I thought the matter over and decided that the only possible way in which I could arrive at a conclusion was to consider the facts of the case for a sufficient length of time, till I was enabled to formulate a theory which would stand every test I could apply to it out of such knowledge as was already at my disposal, and then make a careful list of further points which were outside my own knowledge, but which must be facts if my theory were correct. These points could then be investigated by persons acting on my behalf, and if they were substantiated, my theory would be conclusively proved. Sir Charles drew a breath. In other words, Roger murmured with a smile to Alicia Dammers, turning 100 words into 6, I decided to employ inductive methods. But he spoke so softly that nobody but Miss Dammers heard him. She smiled back appreciatively. The art of the written word is not that of the spoken one. I formed my theory, announced Sir Charles, with surprising simplicity. Perhaps he was still a little short of breath. I formed my theory. Of necessity, much of it was guesswork. Let me give an example. The possession by the criminal of a sheet of Mason and Sons notepaper had puzzled me more than anything. It was not an article which the individual I had in mind might be expected to possess, still less to be able to acquire. I could not conceive any method by which, the plot already decided upon and the sheet of paper required for its accomplishment, such a thing could be deliberately acquired by the individual in question without suspicion being raised afterwards. I therefore formed the conclusion that it was the actual ability to obtain a piece of Mason's notepaper in a totally unsuspicious way, which was the reason of the notepaper of that particular firm being employed at all. Sir Charles looked triumphantly round, as if awaiting something. Roger supplied it, no less readily for all that the point must have occurred to everyone as being almost too obvious to need any comment. That's a very interesting point indeed, Sir Charles. Most ingenious. Sir Charles nodded his agreement. Sheer guesswork, I admit. Nothing but guesswork. But guesswork that was justified in the result. Sir Charles was becoming so lost in admiration of his own perspicacity that he had forgotten all his love of long, winding sentences and smooth-rolling subordinate clauses. His massive head positively jerked on his shoulders. I considered how such a thing might come into one's possession, and whether the possession could be verified afterwards. It occurred to me at last that many firms insert a piece of notepaper with a receipted bill with the words, "with compliments," or some such phrase typed on it. That gave me 3 questions. Was this practice employed at Mason's? Had the individual in question an account at Mason's, or more particularly, to explain the yellowed edge of the paper, had there been such an account in the past? Were there any indications on the paper of such a phrase having been carefully erased? Ladies and gentlemen, boomed Sir Charles, puce with excitement, you will see that the odds against those 3 questions being answered in the affirmative were enormous, overwhelming. Before I posed them, I knew that, should it prove to be the case, no mere chance could be held responsible. Sir Charles dropped his voice. I knew, he said slowly, that if those 3 questions of mine were answered in the affirmative, the individual I had in mind must be as guilty as if I had actually watched the poison being injected into those chocolates. He paused and looked impressively round him, riveting all eyes on his face. Ladies and gentlemen, those 3 questions were answered in the affirmative. Oratory is a powerful art. Roger knew perfectly well that Sir Charles, out of sheer force of habit, was employing on them all the usual and hackneyed forensic tricks. It was with difficulty, Roger felt, that he refrained from adding "of the jury" to his "ladies and gentlemen," but really this was only what might have been expected. Sir Charles had a good story to tell, and a story in which he obviously sincerely believed, and he was simply telling it in the way which, after all these years of practice, came most naturally to him. That was not what was annoying Roger. What did annoy him was that he himself had been plodding on the scent of quite a different hare, and convinced as he had been that his must be the right one, had at first been only mildly amused as Sir Charles flirted round the skirts of his own quarry. Now he had allowed himself to be influenced by mere rhetoric, cheap though he knew it to be, into wondering. But was it only rhetoric that had made him begin to doubt? Sir Charles seemed to have some substantial facts to weave into the airy web of his oratory. And pompous old fellow though he might be, he was certainly no fool. Roger began to feel distinctly uneasy, for his own hair, he had to admit, was a very elusive one. As Sir Charles proceeded to develop his thesis, Roger's uneasiness began to turn into downright unhappiness. There can be no doubt about it. I ascertained through an agent that Mason's, an old-fashioned firm, invariably paid such private customers as had an account with them, 9/10 of their business, of course, is wholesale, the courtesy of including a statement of thanks, just 2 or 3 words typed in the middle of a sheet of notepaper. I ascertained that this individual had had an account with the firm, which was apparently closed 5 months ago. That is to say, a cheque was sent then in settlement, and no goods have been ordered since. Moreover, I found time to pay a special visit myself to Scotland Yard in order to examine that letter again. By looking at the back, I could make out quite distinct, though indecipherable traces of former typewritten words in the middle of the page. These latter cut halfway down one of the lines of the letter, and so prove that they could not have been an erasure from that. They correspond in length to the statement I expected, and they show signs of the most careful attempts, by rubbing, rolling, and re-roughening the smoothed paper, to eradicate not only the typewriter ink, but even the actual indentations caused by the metal letter arms. This I held to be conclusive proof that my theory was correct, and at once I set about clearing up such other doubtful points as had occurred to me. Time was short, and I had recourse to no less than 4 firms of trustworthy inquiry agents, among whom I divided the task of providing the data I was seeking. This not only saved me considerable time, but had the advantage of not putting the sum total of the information obtained into any hands but my own. Indeed, I did my best so to split up my queries as to prevent any of the firms from even guessing what object I had in mind, and in this I am of the opinion that I have been successful. My next care was the postmark. It was necessary for my case that I should prove that my suspect had actually been in the neighbourhood of the Strand at the time in question. You will say, suggested Sir Charles, searching the interested faces round him, and apparently picking upon Mr. Morton Harrogate Bradley as the raiser of this futile objection. You will say, said Sir Charles sternly to Mr. Bradley, that this was not necessary. The parcel might have been posted quite innocently by an unwitting accomplice to whom it had been entrusted, so that the actual criminal had an unshakable alibi for that period. The more so as the individual to whom I refer was actually not in this country, so that it would be all the easier to request a friend who might be travelling to England to undertake the task of posting the parcel in this country, and so saving the cost of the foreign postage, which on parcels is not inconsiderable. I do not agree, said Sir Charles to Mr. Bradley, still more severely. I have considered that point, and I do not think the individual I have in mind would undertake such a very grave risk, for the friend would almost certainly remember the incident when she read of the affair in the papers, as would be almost inevitable. No, concluded Sir Charles, finally crushing Mr. Bradley once and for all, I am convinced that the individual I am thinking of would realize that nobody else must handle that parcel till it had passed into the keeping of the post office. Of course, said Mr. Bradley academically, Lady Pennefather may have had not an innocent accomplice but a guilty one. You've considered that, of course. Mr. Bradley managed to convey that the matter was of no real interest, but as Sir Charles had been addressing these remarks directly to him, it was only courteous to comment on them. Sir Charles purpled visibly. He had been priding himself on the skilful way in which he had been withholding his suspect's name, to bring it out with a lovely plump right at the end after proving his case, just like a real detective story. And now this wretched scribbler of the things had spoilt it all. "Sir," he intoned, in proper Johnsonian manner, "I must call your attention to the fact that I have mentioned no names at all. To do such a thing is most imprudent. Do I need to remind you that there is such a thing as a law of libel?" Morton Harrogate smiled his maddeningly superior smile. He really was a most insufferable young man. "Really, Sir Charles," he mocked, stroking his little sleek object he wore on his upper lip. "I'm not going to write a story about Lady Pennefather trying to murder her husband, if that's what you're warning me against. Or could it possibly be that you were referring to the law of slander?" Sir Charles, who had meant slander, enveloped Mr. Bradley in a crimson glare. Roger sped to the rescue. The combatants reminded him of a bull and a gadfly, and that is a contest which it is often good fun to watch. But the crime circle had been founded to investigate the crimes of others, not to provide opportunities for new ones. Roger did not particularly like either the bull or the gadfly, but both amused him in their different ways. He certainly disliked neither. Mr. Bradley, on the other hand, disliked both Roger and Sir Charles. He disliked Roger the more of the two, because Roger was a gentleman and pretended not to be, whereas he himself was not a gentleman and pretended he was. And that surely is cause enough to dislike anyone. "I'm glad you raised that point, Sir Charles," Roger now said smoothly. "It's one we must consider. Personally, I don't see how we're to progress at all, unless we come to some arrangement concerning the law of slander, do you?" Sir Charles consented to be mollified. "It is a difficult point," he agreed, the lawyer in him immediately swamping the outraged human being. "A born lawyer will turn aside from any other minor pursuit, even briefs, for a really knotty legal point, just as a born woman will put on her best set of underclothes and powder her nose before inserting the latter in the gas oven." "I think," Roger said carefully, anxious not to wound legal susceptibilities — it was a bold proposition for a layman to make — "that we should disregard that particular law. I mean," he added hastily, observing the look of pain on Sir Charles's brow at being asked to condone this violation of a lex intangenda, "I mean, we should come to some such arrangement as that anything said in this room should be without prejudice, or among friends, or not in the spirit of the adverb," he plunged desperately, "or whatever the legal wriggle is." On the whole, it was not a tactful speech, but it is doubtful whether Sir Charles heard it. A dreamy look had come into his eyes, as of a lord of appeal crooning over a piece of red tape. "Slander, as we all know," he murmured, "consists in the malicious speaking of such words as render the party who speaks them in the hearing of others liable to an action at the suit of the party to whom they apply. In this case, the imputation being of a crime or misdemeanor which is punishable corporeally, pecuniary damage would not have to be proved, and, the imputation being defamatory, its falsity would be presumed, and the burden of proving its truth would be laid upon the defendant. We should therefore have the interesting situation of the defendant in a slander action becoming, in essence, the plaintiff in a civil suit for murder. And really," said Sir Charles in much perplexity, "I don't know what would happen then." What about privilege?" suggested Roger feebly. "Of course," Sir Charles disregarded him. "There would have to be stated in the declaration the actual words used, not merely their meaning and general inference, and failure to prove them as stated would result in the plaintiff being non-suited, so that unless notes were taken here and signed by a witness who had heard the defamation, I do not quite see how an action could lie." "Privilege?" murmured Roger despairingly. "Moreover, I should be of the opinion," said Sir Charles, brightening, "that this might be regarded as one of those proper occasions upon which statements, in themselves defamatory and even false, may be made if from a perfectly proper motive and with an entire belief in their truth. In that case, the presumption would be reversed and the burden would be on the plaintiff to prove, and that to the satisfaction of a jury, that the defendant was actuated by express malice. In that case, I rather fancy that the court would be guided almost wholly by considerations of public expediency, which would probably mean that— "Privilege," said Roger loudly. Sir Charles turned on him the dull eye of a red-ink fiend, but this time the word had penetrated. "I was coming to that," he reproved. "Now, in our case, I hardly think that a plea of public privilege would be accepted. As to private privilege, the limits are of course exceedingly difficult to define. It would be doubtful if we could plead successfully that all statements made here are matters of purely private communication, because it is a question whether this circle does constitute, in actual fact, a private or a public gathering. One could, said Sir Charles with much interest, argue either way, or even, for the matter of that it is a private body meeting in public, or vice versa, a public gathering held in private. The point is a very debatable one." Sir Charles swung his glasses for a moment to emphasize the extreme debatability of the point. "But I do feel inclined to venture the opinion," he plunged at last, "that on the whole we might be justified in taking up our stand upon the submission that the occasion is privileged, in so far as it is concerned entirely with communications which are made with no animus injuriandi, but solely in performance of a duty not necessarily legal, but moral or social. And any statements so uttered are covered by a plea veritas convici being made within proper limits by persons in the bona fide prosecution of their own and the public interest. I am bound to say, however," Sir Charles immediately proceeded to hedge, as if horrified at having committed himself at last, "that this is not a matter of complete certainty, and a wiser policy might be to avoid the direct mention of any name, while holding ourselves free to indicate in some unmistakable manner, such as by signs, or possibly by some form of impersonation or acting, the individual to whom we severally refer." "Still," pursued the President, faint but persistent, "on the whole you do think that the occasion may be regarded as privileged, and we may go ahead and mention any name we like." Sir Charles's glasses described a complete and symbolical circle. "I think," said Sir Charles very weightily indeed, after all, it was an opinion which would have cost the circle such a surprisingly round sum had it been delivered in chambers, that Sir Charles need not be grudged a little weight in the delivering of it. "I think," said Sir Charles, "that we might take that risk." "Right-ho," said the President with relief.